Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses, as we conclude with Part 51, Part 5, Templars, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, from the Gnostics and Their Remains, Ancient and Medieval by C.W. King. Part 5, Templars, Rosicrucians, Freemasons. Inscriptiones propter quas vadimonium deseri possit at cum intraveris dideque quam nihil in medio invenies. Templars, Rosicrucians, Freemasons. Preservation of Gnostic symbols amongst the Freemasons. Masonic Origins. At the first sight, it is absolutely startling to recognize so many Gnostic, primarily Indian symbols, figuring so conspicuously amongst the insignia and illustrated formulae of our Freemasons, and that too, apparently in their original sense, as exponents of the deepest mysteries, human and divine, a circumstance of itself lending a specious color to the pretensions of the order, to the most venerable antiquity. Inscriptiones propter quas vadimonia deseri possint, sed ubi intraveris dideque quam nihil in medio invenies, to quote old Pliny's words in speaking of the charlatans of his day. For the pleasing illusion vanishes when we come to investigate the line of their descent, and the fraternity, though claiming them as its own legitimate inheritance, turns out at the end a mere daw in borrowed plumes. To begin by stating these claims as recently put forward by one of their most zealous and pugnacious defenders, the mere title may be comparatively modern, for the society in antediluvian, yes, and prehistorical times most undoubtedly was not called Freemasonry, but the thing was in existence and has descended to our own day. On the arrival of the Romans in Britain, we find Caesar and several of the Roman generals who succeeded him in the government of the island becoming patrons and protectors of the craft. But there is no information to be found in regard to the usages and customs prevalent among them at that time. Their lodges and conventions were regularly held, but were open only to the initiated fellows. There is enough, however, to show that the same society which now flourishes everywhere was then in existence, holding lodges and conventions and having its initiated fellows. I may add that a regular list of Grand Masters can be produced quite as genuine and reliable as that of the Archbishops of Canterbury or of the Kings of England. If that in itself is not valid evidence enough of the continued existence of the same society in England from the earliest historical period down to the present date, I don't know what would be admitted as sufficient evidence. Going back to AD 300, we find the Emperor Carausius supporting it and appointing Albanus his steward, Grand Master. This was none other than the famous St. Alban, the first British martyr who was born at Verulam, now St. Albans, in Hertfordshire. The above is an unusually brilliant specimen of the logic of the Brotherhood, that assumes in every notice of building and builders to be found in antiquity a recognition of the then existence of their own society exactly as at present constituted. The old guild of working masons seems to have made pretensions of the same nature, if we allow the genuineness of the supposed Bodleian manuscripts copied by Locke. For their great patron Henry VI informs his scholar that the mystery was first brought into England by Peter Gower, Pythagoras, a corruption of the name, by the way, plainly betraying that he had obtained this piece of information from a French mouth, probably from someone in the suite of his queen. It is not unlikely that this connection of the father of mathematics with the building trade arose from the study of that science by the Greek and Roman architects. For upon the vital importance of a knowledge of mathematics to his own profession, Vitruvius repeatedly and strongly insists. But this very king, whom our Freemasons claim as their chief resuscitator, furnishes the most conclusive evidence against the reality of their modern pretensions. By the advice of the Bishop of Winchester, better known as Cardinal Beaufort, he passed an act in his third year forbidding Masons to hold lodges or any meetings whatsoever, which protection is clearly directed against no higher things than mere trade union proceedings. But at a later period he showed the Masons more favor and even attended their meetings, as did his contemporary James I of Scotland. But the question is set at rest by the language of the act. First, whereas by the assembling congregations and confederacies made by the Masons in their grand chapters and assemblies, the good cause and effect of the statute of laborers be openly violated and broken, in subversion of the law and to the great damage of all the commons, our said Lord the King willing in this case to provide remedy by the advice and assent aforesaid, and at the special request of the said commons hath ordered and established that such chapiters and congregations shall not be hereafter made, they that cause such chapiters and congregations to be assembled and holden, if they thereof be convict, shall be judged for felons, and that all the other Masons that come to such chapiters and congregations be punished by imprisonment of their bodies and make fine and ransom at the King's will. The earliest Masonic document. The language of this act is sufficiently conclusive, but for accumulation of proofs, I shall proceed to establish the same position by giving a summary of the oldest and only genuine document extant on the subject of Masonry. This document is thus seen here, written in a hand that cannot be later than the close of the 13th century, and of which a copy has been published by Joe Halliwell. It commences with a history of architecture from the beginning and of the introduction of the art into England, and then proceeds to give in rhyme the rules of the craft, conceived in precisely the same business-like spirit as those of a trades union. The preamble is, Hic incipient constitutionis artis geometricae secundum Euclidem. What follows is a much condensed summary of the sense of the old Masons' rhymes. Once upon a time, a certain king and his nobles had such large families as to be unable to maintain them decently, and taking counsel together, devised they should be taught some trade whereby to live. A great clerk, Euclid, proposed teaching them geometry, called Masonry, the most honest craft of all. He ordered that the most advanced of his scholars should be styled master by the rest, but that he should call none of his inferiors either subject or servant, but always my dear brother. In this manner, by good wit and geometry, began first the craft of Masonry. Euclid invented and taught the same in Egypt. Many years afterwards it was brought into England in King Athelstan's time. This good king loved the craft and built many towers, halls, bowers and temples. But finding out many defects in the craft, he determined to reform the same, and summoned an assembly of all the Masons in England, together with all his lords and commons, and 15 articles there they brought, and 15 points there they wrote. 1. The master must be just and true, and pay his fellows according to the price of provisions. Neither exact more from his employer than he pays his men, nor take bribes from either side. 2. Every master mason must attend the general congregation or assembly, wherever it shall be held, unless hindered by sickness, else shall he be accounted disobedient to the craft and full of falseness. 3. No prentice to be taken for less than 7 years, for in less time he cannot learn his business either to his employer's profit or to his own. 4. No bondsman may be taken for prentice. Otherwise it might so happen that his lord might take him out of the lodge itself, and so occasion great tumult, for all the Masons would stand together by their fellow. The prentice must therefore be taken of the master's own degree, but of old times it was ordained he should be of gentle blood, and even great lords' sons took to this geometry. 5. The prentice must be of lawful birth and sound both in mind and body, for an imperfect man of such blood should do the craft but little good. A maimed man he hath no might, ye may it know and long ere night. 6. The master must not take from his employer the same pay for the prentice as for the perfect workman. Nevertheless, before the prentice's time is out, as he increases in knowledge, so may his wages be proportionably raised. 7. The master must neither for love nor money clothe, feed, or harbor a thief, nor a homicide, nor one of bad fame, all which would bring the craft to shame. 8. If the master finds any of his men incompetent, he must turn him off, and take another in his place, as such a hand would do the craft short worship. 9. The master must undertake no job that he is unable to finish, and must see that he lays the foundation so that it will neither give nor crack. 10. No master mason must supplant another under penalty of £10, unless where the work has tumbled down through the incompetence of the first builder. In all points of this curious craft, masons must live together like brethren. 11. No mason is to work by night unless for the sake of trying experiments for amending error. 12. No mason must disparage the work of another, but rather must praise the same, and if wrong, privately advise him how to aright it. 13. The apprentice must be taught every branch of the business and be put upon work suitable to his ability. 14. The master must take no apprentices unless he have divers jobs in hand in order to teach them the trade. 15. The apprentice must be a friend to his master. Never deceive him for the sake of another, neither stand by his fellows in a wrong cause, nor take a false oath. These 15 points were likewise ordained at the aforesaid assembly. 1. The Mason must love God, Holy Church, and his fellow Masons, wheresoever he may go. 2. The Mason must work as truly as he can upon the workday, and so deserve his pay upon the holy day. 3. The apprentice is on no account to divulge any trade secrets. This third point, it must be special. Let the apprentice know it well, his master's counsel he keep and close, and his fellows by good purpose. The secrets of the chamber he tell to none, nor in the lodge whatever is done. Whatever thou seest or hearest them do, tell it no man wherever thou go. The counsel of hall and eke of bower, keep it well in great honour, lest it should bring thyself to blame, and bring the craft into great shame. 4. That no mason be false to the craft, nor maintain his cause against it, neither do prejudice to master nor fellow, and that the apprentice stand in awe. 5. The master must take his wages, whatever ordained him, without disputing. The master, if unable to find them work as before, to give them warning in the forenoon. 6. If any dispute or quarrel arise amongst the Masons, the master must make them put off the settlement thereof until the next holy day, and not allow it to be settled upon a work day, lest it should hinder the work in hand. 7. Not to lie with thy master's or fellow's wife or concubine under penalty of serving another 7 years of apprenticeship. 8. If thou hast taken any job under thy master, be a faithful middleman between thy master and thy fellows. 9. When the fellows have a common chamber, then they must take the stewardship in turns, week by week. All victuals to be paid for as received, and regular accounts to be kept of the common expenses. Of thy fellows' goods that thou hast spent, when and how, and to what end, such accounts thou must come to when thy fellows would thou do. 10. If a mason lives amiss and is false to his work, he must, without favour, be convened before the assembly and punished according to the law of old ordained, or in case he refuses to appear, he must forswear the profession. 11. If a skilled mason observe his fellow cutting a stone and likely to spoil it through his own ignorance, he must advise him in fair words and teach him how to amend it, not to bring shame upon the whole work. 12. That whatever shall be ordained in the assembly, being present the master and fellows, nobles, burghers, and the sheriff of the county, and the mayor of the town, that thou shalt maintain against all thy fellows, if disposed to dispute the same. 13. The mason must swear never to be a thief himself, nor for any fee or reward to abet one that is. 14. Before the assembly breaks up, each must be sworn unto his master and fellows, to the king, and to all these present. Also they must seek out every one that hath contravened any one law thereof, and bring them up before the assembly. 15. And if found guilty, they must forswear the craft. And so mason's craft they must refuse, and swear it never more to use, unless they consent to make amends. If refractory, the sheriff is to cast them into prison during the king's good pleasure, and take their goods and chattels for the king's use. The assembly must be held every year, or at least every 3rd year. Unto the same must come every man of the craft, and all the great nobles, to amend all infractions, and to swear obedience to the constitutions of King Athelstan, and especially to make bold petition to the king that he stand by the masons everywhere and enforce the same statutes. Next follows Ars Quatuor Coronatorum, a manual of religious and moral duties, and also of good manners in company. The 4 master, who were as good masons as on earth could go, gravers and image makers they were also, were commanded by the emperor to make an idol to be worshipped. On their refusal, he first imprisoned and tortured them, and at last put them to death. These be the Quatuori Coronati, and their festival falls on the 8th day after All Saints. Many years after Noah's flood was begun the Tower of Babylon. It was built up to the height of 7 miles by order of Nebuchadnezzar for a refuge in case of another deluge. But an angel, in order to punish his pride, smote all the builders with confusion of tongues. After this, Euclid taught geometry and gave his scholars the following rules. Behavior in church: to use the holy water on going in, to kneel down, never sit nor stand, make no noise nor talk, but pray all the time, saying certain prayers given in the text. To attend Mass daily, but if at work, to repeat a certain prayer upon hearing the Mass bell. In company, on coming before a lord, to doff cap or hood, nor put in on again until bid. Make 2 or 3 bows with the right leg, hold up thy chin, look him sweetly in the face. Do not scrape the foot, nor spit or blow thy nose. On entering a hall amongst the jontels, be not presumptuous on account of thy birth or skill. In hall or chamber where thou dost gan, good manners make the man. When sitting down to meat, see thy hands be clean and knife sharp. Cut the bread and meat ready for eating. If sitting by a worshipful man, suffer him to help himself first. Keep thy hands clean, smudge not the napkin, on which thou must not blow thy nose, nor pick thy teeth at table, neither drink with anything in the mouth, nor dip thy chin too deep in the cup, nor talk to thy neighbor when drinking. In chamber among the ladies bright, spare thy tongue and spend thy sight. Talk not of thine own matters, neither for mirth nor for meed. Play only with thine equals. On meeting a man of worship, be sure to cap him, walk a little way behind him, never interrupt his speech. Be brief and fair in thy replies, etc. Christ then of his grace give you both the wit and space, well this book to con and read, heaven to have for your Mede. Amen, amen, so mote it be, so say we all par charité. Any reader of common intelligence will perceive that the good priest, author of this, the oldest extant document upon Masonry, had not the remotest idea of the same as being the possession of a secret society established for some hidden end, whether religious or political. The very rules which he professes to transcribe from the constitutions of Athelstan are as plain-spoken, matter-of-fact, as these of a modern trades union, differing only from the latter in the larger admixture of common sense and honesty that they display, the whole winding up with directions for behavior in good society, as laid down by some anticipatory Chesterfield. The secrets of the lodge are manifestly nothing more than matters pertaining to the trade discussed amongst the Masons at their lodgings after work, and very inexpedient for them to be divulged to outsiders. And to come to the most essential point of the question which these constitutions fully establish, the assembly is so far from being a secret chapter held by the free and accepted brethren only, that it must actually be presided over by the sheriff of the county and the mayor of the town where it is held, for the purpose of settling all matters connected with the building trade, being in fact nothing more than what was called in those times an assize of labor. No relation of modern Masons to medieval guilds. An interesting feature in the treatise is the fact of its ascribing these same constitutions to King Athelstan. There is very good reason for accepting this statement as founded upon trustworthy tradition. The Saxon prince was the first British sovereign who possessed either wealth or inclination for decorative architecture or building of any sort. His father, Edward the Elder, and his aunt Ethelfleda, the Lady of Mercia, are recorded as the first of the Saxon line who built fortifications of stone about their chief cities. Before this, the Saxons, like all other Teutons, had no other idea of building than of constructions in wood. All stonemasons had to be brought over from France when wanted, as numerous references, unnecessary here to quote, conclusively evince, in which country architecture had kept up a feeble existence after the fall of the empire, its preservation being due to the patronage of the church, which kept growing in wealth and power in proportion as the Roman authority died away. The simplicity of the constitutions in prescribing the convening of mere craftsmen under the presidency of the sheriff and mayor betokens a truly Saxon state of society, and moreover a time when these masons were actually working men. Under the Normans, regular architects, in one sense, first appear as the masters, who were almost invariably churchmen. Furthermore, the prohibition against taking a bondman for apprentice unmistakably betokens the same early period, when domestic slavery, not mere villanage, was recognized by law. The Norman legislation makes no such distinction of bond and free. Aubrey indeed quotes the authority of Dugdale that the fraternity of adopted Masons, having signs and passwords for the purpose of mutual recognition, owed its origin to a company of Italian Masons who in Henry III's time obtained a patent from the Pope to go about Europe, building churches. But the absurdity of this statement is manifested by a single fact. When the Italians of that period wished to erect any important edifice, so far from being competent to do so for other nations, they were forced to call in architects from Germany and France. To give a few decisive examples as regards the wealthiest and most polished states of that country, Pisa employed Guglielmo il Tedesco to plan her celebrated Campanile. Florence Lapo, alias Jacopo il Tedesco, father of Arnolfo, who had already gained high reputation by the triple church he had built at Assisi for the Franciscans, to construct their bridge alla Carraia, the Bargello or town hall, several churches, and to drain the Piazza Grande. Even a century later, the Visconti were obliged to employ German architects to design the Duomo at Milan. It is true Henry III had in his pay one Peter Civis Romanus, but only in the capacity of a decorative artist for the mosaic work at the Westminster Shrine. But in truth, during the entire Gothic period, architecture, as a national art, may be said to have been extinct in Italy, the grand center of the art then being established in the very middle of France. All this evidence goes to show that our Freemasons have no relationship, either actual or traditional, with the medieval guilds bearing the same appellation, a pretense they so zealously maintain. The latter were corporations of real workmen, in which each person, after serving a regular apprenticeship, and according to the custom still kept up in some counties, producing a trial piece to prove his competency, was admitted free of the guild and accepted amongst the members of the same. The computations accompanying the ceremony are in truth the sole point of resemblance between the ancient and the modern Freemasons. The Bulletin Monumental for 1884 contains a memoir, Les signes de Tacheron sur les remparts d'Avignon, which gives the fullest collection, 6 pages, of these marks that has ever been published. They can be here traced from Roman times, where they appear as single letters, or as Trionian shorthand down to the actual Mason's marks of medieval and modern times. Many clearly represent the tools used in building. Some of these marks, and more of those from Avignon, are to be recognized upon Lichfield's Baphometic tablet, which may, after all, be no modern forgery, but a genuine register of such sagely of the 17th century. Most interesting of all, on account of their early date, are the Mason's marks at Westminster Hall, lately published by Dr. Freshfield in the Archaeologia, Volume 50, Part 1. The medieval Guild of Masons, as we have seen, was no more a secret society than were the guilds of carpenters, cordwainers, or tailors. Every man indeed belonging to the first named, and this is the only thing belonging to the craft that really carries with it an air of mysterious antiquity, had upon admission a mark or cipher assigned him, which he was bound to put upon every stone he dressed, a rule still observed in order to distinguish his work from that of his fellows, against the time when the materials should be examined by the master mason, who paid him for those approved but stopped his wages for those spoiled through his fault. Similarly, every merchant of the staple joined with his initials upon his seal or trademark, the mark of the staple town to which he belonged. This latter, though much alike in outline, was variously modified so as to indicate each of the 15 towns in England, Ireland, and Wales appointed by Edward III. In all medieval documents relating to building, the name Freemason signifies merely the worker in hewn stone, the inferior workman who ran up the body of the wall in rubble or ragstone being called the rough-waller. Lastly, a very puzzling question presents itself. If our Freemasons be the legitimate successors in an unbroken line of the ancient lodges and guilds, how came it that all the principles of Gothic architecture were utterly lost within less than a century? Mason's marks. But to return to the marks themselves, of which many collections have been published, gathered from regions the most widely separated, their history is indeed full of interest, but likewise of obscurity. Res alta nocte et caligina Marseille. Many of them are traditional and go back to the highest antiquity, being found on Phoenician and Greek buildings, as well as on vases and coins of the earliest times, and in still larger abundance and variety in all medieval architecture. A most interesting example is the stone in the second course of the temple wall, SE Jerusalem, discovered January 1869. It bears 2 marks, deeply cut, thus and thus seen here. Other marks in red paint resemble Phoenician letters. Deutsch observed many such on the walls of the old castle of Sidon, built from ancient materials. He considers them numeral, unity to 9 being represented by vertical lines, 10 by a horizontal, 20 by 2 parallels, etc. It is, however, ridiculous to attribute the foundation of the temple wall to Solomon's architects. The fact of its being cut through 10 feet of rubbish thrown from above proves it to have been done long after the city was inhabited and therefore the work of Agrippa. These marks were in the beginning religious symbols, many of them being identical with the caste marks, whereby to this day the followers of the respective Hindu gods are distinguished from one another. This religious significance explains also their occurrence on Celtic monuments, as on the Stonehenge lintel and the Newton stone Aberdeen, and so numerously on the Gallic coins, but they have for centuries, further back than can be traced, degenerated into the mere signatures of illiterate mechanics. Who have introduced a refinement upon the old system, viz. The necessity of every mark terminating in an odd number of ends? To illustrate this curious point, I shall adduce a few of the most remarkable examples of lapidary symbolism, giving, as in duty bound, precedence to the late discovery at Stonehenge. Regular mason's marks are visible upon the great hewn stones of the Buddhist buildings at Sarnath, which are known to have been erected before the 6th century. And more of the same kind are found on the ruined buildings of the same religion, still to be traced incorporated into the Brahminical edifices within the neighboring Benares, Shering, sacred city of the Hindus. The mark is cut upon the fallen impost lying across the supposed altar. It is 9 inches long and clearly defined, and may be described as a semicircle of which the diameter being produced, its own length terminates in a second semicircle, reversed and open, combined with the Roman letters L, V, having in fact much the appearance of a sigla or nota scriptoria. The mark has therefore something in its look that suggests the signature LVCIus. Had the sagacious Stukely discovered this inscription, he would unquestionably, upon the strength thereof, have ascribed the whole fabric to the British Lucius, so renowned in fable. It must not, however, be concealed that our fashionable skepticism has impugned the reality of even this most venerable handwriting on the wall. Dr. Thurman has hunted up 3 credible witnesses ready to make affidavit that they saw with their own eyes a certain stranger cut the sigil. It must be remembered the stone is so hardened by weathering as to turn the best chisel. But inasmuch as it would be equally facile, by means of leading questions dexterously put, to obtain the testimony of the same number of bucolical juveniles, that they were present at the erection of Stonehenge itself, the genuineness of the mark, so unmodern in configuration, seems to me in no measure disproved. Symbolic figures, spirals and interesting circles are found on the stones in Newton Grange, Drogheda Cave, Ruth Lynn, Old Berwick, Doddington Moor, Northumberland, Long Meg, Cumberland. The latter have been published in the Archaeological Journal. But to proceed to actual caste marks, we find a casual allusion to their use in ancient writers who state that the badges distinguishing the 3 orders of the Egyptian priesthood were the following, seen here, signifying the sun, the Tao eternal life, and the following, seen here, pleasure. With the Hindus, the equilateral triangle symbolizes Mahadeva, or Siva, that is, the element fire personified. The same figure inverted stands for Vishnu, water. The 2, intersecting each other, form the Shirkan, or 6 points, that is, the 2 elements in conjunction. The 5-pointed figure made by bisecting the sides of an equilateral triangle by a line as long as one side and drawing lines from each extremity of the said line to each foot of the triangle, symbol of Siva and Brahma, the latter god having 5 heads, became later the famous Solomon's seal. This appellation it must have got in early times, as in virtue thereof it is sculptured along with the 7-branched candlestick upon civish tombs dating from the Lower Empire. Numerous examples may be seen in their catacomb at Rome, lately discovered. The Hindus still venerate the figure as replete with virtue. Similarly, the Shirkan is engraved on a large scale upon each side of the gate of the fort at Agra, although the building is of Mohammedan work. A point puru is the deity, self-existing. A circle, Brahm, eternity. Hence a triangle within a circle is the emblem of Trinity and unity, and the circle inscribed within a triangle the converse. Worshippers of Sakti, the female principle, mark their sacred vase with a right angle bisected by a line, and similarly, the worshippers of Isis use so to mark the vessel necessary at her rites. But the Vaishnavas have for the same object a symbol of wondrous vitality and diffusion, for it is seen equally on Greek coins and vases, on the Newton stone Aberdeen, in ecclesiastical sculpture where it takes the name tetragrammaton, being ignorantly supposed the compounds of the letter seen here 4 times repeated, and its sound and power confounded with those of the sacred tetragrammaton, or the Hebrew quadriliteral name Jehovah. This mark is properly the symbol of Sitala, the 7th incarnation, entitled Trithalisor, a title exactly translated by the alchemical Trismegistus. Its name is the swastika, an emblem of resignation, so that the figure may have passed into Byzantine art, with some recommendation from a knowledge of its real meaning. In Gothic nomenclature, this mark becomes the equally renowned Filfot, as to whose etymology the following conjecture may be hazarded. The swastika signified at first the arms crossed over the breast, the regular Indian gesture of submission, and also the legs similarly folded as the statues of Buddha are usually represented. The symbol is evidently nothing more than the rough outline of the arms and legs thus disposed. May not therefore the Gothic name Filfot, applied to the same hieroglyph, bear through some remote tradition a reference to its real meaning and imply the sense of fold foot? In the same way, the old Greeks appear to have recognized its true sense when they changed its simple form into the 3 conjoined legs that so aptly allude to the name Trinacria. In all probability, the great popularity of the symbol, wheresoever the Indo-Germanic race penetrated, was due to the same feeling that renders it still so respected in the land of its origin, its power as a talisman to protect all places where the figure is painted up. The exclamation, swastika, the Hindus still employ as a mode of assent, synonymous with Amen, so be it. Or to speak Masonically, so mote it be. As the symbol of resignation, the mark forms the distinctive badge of an ascetic. When a man desires to become a Bandya, Buddhist monk, the rites required for his initiation occupy 3 days, foremost amongst which the swastika is solemnly set up upon an altar of unbaked bricks, the neophyte being seated on the ground with his legs disposed after the same fashion. In China, the mark is the badge of the Pon, the strictest sect of Buddhists who attribute its invention to Buddha himself about 6 centuries before our era. This fact may explain how denying oneself and taking up the cross came to signify the embracing an ascetic life. For so evident are the traces of Buddhist influence over the institutions of the Essenes that it is probable enough the symbol retained its pristine acceptation amongst the sect. The swastika occurs amongst the signet devices of the old Jaina kings of Gujarat, belonging to the far-removed epoch of Buddhist supremacy in Hindustan, in company with that intricate square figure which, when appearing on Greek works, is denominated a labyrinth. Other sectarian marks are 3 parallel lines placed horizontally or vertically to denote their respective deities. Others of truly Masonic aspect are the wheel, crescent, heart, vesica piscis, all variously modified to express ritualistic differences. That the Gnostics borrowed many of these symbols directly from Buddhism, adding them to their old stock of Egyptian devices, is apparent upon the inspection of any large collection of Abraxas gems. Scythicus, the preceptor of Manas, is actually declared by Epiphanius to have picked up his novel ideas during his visits to India as a trader from Alexandria. The lingering influence of this importation continually peep out where least to be expected. In the finest known manuscript of the Apocalypse, the work of a French illuminator about the middle of the 13th century, in the library of Trinity College, Cambridge, the most elaborate of all its decorations is the heading to chapter 14, filling half a page. It represents the Lamb standing upon Mount Zion, surrounded by the saints. Above is the Godhead, typified by an immense golden quatrefoil, encompassed by the 4 beasts which bear the names of the evangelists. At each side and below are the 24 elders, arranged in groups of 6, 8, and 10. Within the quatrefoil is seen an empty throne covered with a cloth crossed by diagonal blue lines. In each diagonal so formed is painted in red a circle containing a point. This geometrical expression of the idea of the deity, so opposed to the characteristic anthropomorphism of regular Gothic art, may perhaps have been inspired by the Manicheist spirit that still actuated the southern French. But to go back to the source, in the Chinese system, Yang, the male active principle, has for his own possession the sun, fire, and all the higher phenomena of nature. To him belong the uneven numbers. Thus, the female passive principle possesses the earth, moon, and the even numbers. The same notion as to the sexes of numbers was taught by Pythagoras and by the Gnostic Marcus after him. Yang is represented by the circle, Yn by the square, the two forces combined, by two interlaced circles as seen here, the actual badge of the medieval Veum Gerichte. Origin of modern Freemasonry. Having thus briefly noticed our Masonic symbols, let us proceed to consider the society itself. And here a circumstance of the utmost importance to this inquiry must always be kept in view. The Freemasons, as at present organized into a mystic fraternity, derive their name from nothing but an accidental circumstance belonging to their first establishment. It was in the common hall of the Loudon Guild of the Freemasons, the trade, that their first meetings were held under Christopher Wren for president in the time of the Commonwealth. In April 1616, when Ashmole was admitted member. Others named as present on that occasion were Lilly the astrologer, Dr. Pearson, the two Whartons, Hewitt, and Orchard the mathematician. Their real object was political, the restoration of monarchy, hence the exclusion of the public and the oath of secrecy enjoined upon the members. The pretense of promoting the study of architecture and the choice of the place where to hold their meetings, suggested by the profession of their president, were no more than blinds to deceive the existing government. There is a curious analogy to all this in the history of another famous society, the Neapolitan Carbonari, which similarly derived its name, terminology, and insignia from the accidental circumstances under which it was created. Like Wren's associates, the first Carbonari were defeated royalists and fanatical republicans joined in unnatural union by one common hatred of the powers that be. The old Bourbonists, equally with the chimerical founders of the short-lived Parthenopean Republic, equally forced to flee for their lives to the mountains. The former to escape the well-deserved vengeance of the French under Murat, the latter so fiercely persecuted by Cardinal Ruffo upon the first restoration of royalty at Naples. These desperate men, lurking about in the Abruzzi forests, were forced to assume the disguise of the only inhabitants of these wild regions, the Carbonari charcoal burners, as the best means of eluding pursuit. After their forces had grown to a regular confederation, the disguise, so suggestive and terror-inspiring, was retained for a uniform. A charcoal sack was the badge of membership, a charcoal measure the throne of the president, and their conclaves were held by rule in the midnight forest. When Ferdinand, the well-beloved, was firmly seated on his ancient throne for the third and last time, his diligent eradication of his former friends, the Constitutionals, folks almost equally crazed with the original Parthenopean patriots, sent thousands of exiles to swell the ranks of the Carbonari. Soon the society was able to establish ramifications all over Italy, thanks to the paternal government of the Austrians and their protégés, the various restored princes of the Bourbon and Este lines, and thus in our own times, Carbonaro and liberal came to mean pretty nearly the same thing, and the Italian Carbonaro to know no more about charcoal burning than the English mason does about building. The Rosicrucians. But although this society of Freemasons was convoked in London and established branches all over England, furnishing also the members with the means for secret recognition, and all for a political end, yet in its true origin, Freemasonry had nothing political in its nature, neither was the aforesaid convocation in London the real commencement of its existence. This final organization was only the adaptation to a special end of another society, then in fullest bloom, the Rosicrucian. If we reflect how rankly both astrology and alchemy were flourishing at that time in England, and that the Rosicrucian sect was essentially of Protestant growth, we may on good grounds conclude that this sect already numbered many English members from amongst the educated classes and the philosophers of the day. Oxford produced the two great lights of the Hermetic philosophy, Robert de Fluctibus, Flood, and his contemporary Eugenius Philithes, Thomas Vaughan. The latter, born in 1612, is said by a writer of the year 1749 to be then living at Nuremberg as the president of the illuminated throughout the world. These last were for the most part ardent royalists, hating the established order of things, joined with many fanatical republicans equally impatient of the new despotism of Cromwell. In the Rosicrucian system, religion and philosophy, the latter meaning little more than astrology and alchemy, were strangely interwoven, and the terminology of the one was borrowed to express the ideas and aspirations of the other. The position of the latter science in this century cannot be more strongly exemplified than by the actual existence of current coins declaring themselves to be made out of hermetic metal by the symbols for mercury and lead, as seen here, stamped on their reverse. Examples are 3 ducats of Gustavus Adolphus, Paris Cabinet, thalers of Wilhelm, Landgrave of Hesse, and contemporary coins of the city of Erfurt. This subject has been well handled by Martin Reg in his memoir, Anciennes Pièces Hermétiques, Revue Numismatique for 1867. This hypothesis is strongly recommended from its adoption by the acute De Quincey in his essay entitled Freemasons and Rosicrucians, London Magazine, 1824, where he shows how the Rosicrucians, when driven by persecution out of Germany, reappeared in England as Freemasons, taking that name from the place of meeting and from nothing else. Under the new appellation, the sect was re-imported into the continent as an English institution. De Quincey, however, makes their object to have been purely religious without any admixture of politics, and so far differs from Nicolai, whose views have been adopted by myself in what precedes, and who, being himself an Illuminato of the first water, ought certainly to be regarded as the higher authority of the two. The latter writer has given in his Temple Heron what appears to be the best supported account of the rise and progress of Rosicrucianism. The Rosicrucians, their rites and mysteries, with chapters on the ancient fire and serpent worshippers, and explanations of the mystic symbols represented in the monuments and talismans of the primeval philosophers, by Hargrave Jennings, London, 1870. A truly Masonic production without method in its madness, but valuable for giving many Rosicrucian or rather Kabbalistic expositions of symbols extracted from Flood's writings. The compiler has moreover laid my Gnostics largely under contribution and even reproduced my engravings with sundry fanciful improvements that wonderfully heighten their mystic value. He points out for its founder a Lutheran mystic, J.V. Andreae, almoner to the Duke of Württemberg early in the 17th century. Solomon Somber, however, in his Collections for the History of Rosicrucianism, assigns a fabulous antiquity to the sect. At least the writings of this divine, wherein the rosy cross prominently figures, were the first indications that made the existence of the fraternity known to the outer world. But Andrea appears to have done no more than borrow the symbols and occult means of communication already existing from time immemorial amongst the astrologers and alchemists. In other words, the wealthy and the learned of the age, when the Emperor Rudolf II was the greatest patron of the curious arts ever recorded in history, in order to employ them on the furtherance of a visionary scheme of his own. This scheme was the fusion of all Christian sects into one universal brotherhood, and the projector wisely commenced his apostleship by attempting to bring over to his side the most eminent of the mass, by the utilization of such ancient and venerated machinery. Exactly the same scheme, based upon Judaism, is the crime that now keeps in perpetual imprisonment. Nicholas Ilvin, the far-famed convent spectre of Solovetsk in the Frozen Sea, universally believed in Russia to be the lost Grand Duke Constantine, Dixon's Free Russia. The well-meaning enthusiast had evidently disregarded the remark of the sagacious Julian, confirmed as it is by the experience of every succeeding generation, owes as much as any. Nullus infestus hominibus bestias ut sunt sibi ferales plerique Christianorum. As a matter of course, his scheme of universal brotherhood dissolved in smoke as soon as established, But the older philosophy, whose garb he had adopted, bloomed with fresh vigor under the new organization and euphonious name. But before going any further, let us, for diversion's sake, hear the Rosicrucians' own story and examine some of their doctrines and insignia which have an important bearing upon the subject of our inquiry. The Rosicrucians, says Boyle, make their founder to have been a certain German, only known as AC, who, having gone to Damascus in the year 1387, was instructed in their mysteries by the College of Arabian sages there established. This tradition may have some truth in it, allowing for an error of locality. At Cairo, the Fatimite sultans, Ismailites be it remembered, had 3 centuries before this date founded the far-famed lodge entitled the House of Wisdom. Here the student passed through 9 degrees, beginning with obedience, mysticism, philosophy, doubt, etc., up to absolute incredulity. William of Tyre, 1917, tells a wonderful story how Hugo of Caesarea and Geoffroy of the Temple, envoys to Cairo on business of the order, were led by the Soldan himself to the Palace Kashif, and conducted through numerous courts of the richest architecture, full of strange birds and beasts, to the inmost hall, where the Soldan, having first adored the unseen master, the curtains of gold and pearl were suddenly drawn back, and that dignitary appeared seated in unspeakable glory on a golden throne, attended by his chief officials. Returning home, he communicated his knowledge to a small number of chosen associates, dying in 1484. It is a matter of importance to notice that in this legend Syria is made the fountainhead of the new philosophy. The Rosicrucian Creed, according to the Essay on Spirits, dedicated to Mr. Locke, 1647, contains, amongst others, this palpable adoption of the Pythagorean system. As seen here, the Templars. In the second paragraph, Clarkson discovers an allusion to the Vesica Piscis, which is in truth a figure generated by 2 circles intersecting at their respective centers. And for the same reason, the secret sign of the Brethren of the Vermegerichte was the 2 annular links of a chain. The symbolical evidence of the Temple Church were the Templars Gnostics. The egg, formed by 3 intersecting circles, contains in its upper section 7 triangles, and as many in its lower section, which are the opposing genii of light and darkness. This was the idol which the Manicheans were accused of worshipping on the charges brought against them by the popes, Clarkson, page 20. Still more does the Vultus Triformis of this creed arrest our attention as bearing a more than accidental affinity to the triple-faced idol, the adoration whereof was so persistently laid to the charge of the Templars, the real meaning of which accusation shall be investigated in its proper place. This same tête d'un homme monstrueuse, image of le Dieu qui ne meurt pas, so often mentioned in the Confessions of the Knights, may be recognized beyond all mistake in the hideous head with flaring hair and beard, and eyes wide open as if just severed from the body, placed upon a box inscribed XPS, which repeatedly occurs amongst the Rosicrucian pictures in the Diary of Hosea Lux. This manuscript, the most remarkable of the kind extant or ever composed, written between the years 1568 and 1612, is full of mystic drawings beautifully done in pen and ink, which may be either prophetic hieroglyphs or else enshroud the arcana of some seeker after the elixir of life. The latter, it would rather seem, to judge from the perpetual introduction of certain very significant emblems. The author must have belonged, as an actual Mason assures me, to a lodge of Templars, as is proved by his use of the hand-in-hand and foot-to-foot insignia. As exhibiting the whole list of the present Masonic signs but employed for Rosicrucian purposes at so early a date, this diary is of the utmost value to the history of the order. Through the kindness of the present owner, Mr. J.E. Hodgkin, F.S.A., I've had opportunity to make a minute examination of the manuscript. To quote a few of the most important embellishments of these mystic pages, the same Baphometic head appears in another place, set on a box inscribed with Solomon's seal, containing a retort. Over the head is a disc, set all round dial fashion but with hearts instead of numerals. In the field is written the opposite motto, Timore et Tremore. Another picture presents the head hovering above the Ark of the Covenant, all enclosed within the outline of a heart out of whose aorta issues a naked boy bearing a flaming star and crescent conjoined. Yet more mysterious is the heart-containing tau over a bell resting upon a star. Above all, for a crest is set Solomon's seal. For supporters to the shield, his pillars Jachin and Boaz, flanked on the right by that king seated, on the left by a naked man standing, who pierces the heart with a long rod. Singular too is the man with uplifted hands, having instead of a face Solomon's seal enclosing a retort. Other symbols frequently occurring on these pictures are the naked boy extended on the spokes of a wheel, or again placed upon an egg set in a candlestick. The king's bust crowned with the winged crescent, on which the merest novice in alchemy can discern the allusion to Regulus of antimony and quicksilver. The egg containing a circle whence issue rays of light, probably typifying the crucible. For another heading shows the same figure within a furnace with the infant metal springing rapturously from its womb. The 5 links of a chain interlaced, all these being Rosicrucian emblems now embalmed in the repertory of the Freemasons. These drawings, besides their artistic value with respect to their fertile invention and incredibly minute finish, Lux being a copperplate engraver of some eminence, are highly interesting as pictorial exponents of the Hermetic philosophy still so flourishing at the time of their execution. Of such designs, nothing can surpass in elaborate execution and impenetrable mystery the large drawing of the naked female standing upon musical notes, holding in her right a torch tipped with a beautiful face whence issue flames, an owl perched upon her extended left hand, on her breast for brooch soul's head in a crescent. Upon a pedestal is set a tall, long-necked alembic containing the most obvious emblem of the generative power, emitting upwards the stream of life which is caught into the mouth of a cherub whose hair forms a bunch of flowers, supporting the before-mentioned disc of hearts, whilst his hand holds forth a wheat sheaf. In the field lies a crown over a marshal's baton shaped like a phallus. Another drawing full of interest is the portrait of a man in a fur cap with plume, wearing round his neck a pendant inscribed like the jewel of the GA, from which again is hung a human foot. With his right hand he points to a crescent divided into 3 parts enclosing Exap. His left rests on the head of a mighty hammer. De Quincey, in the above-quoted essay, describes a manuscript work by Seaman Stadion of Württemberg, written in the year 1604, under the title Neometria, seu nuda et prima libri, intus et foris scripti expositio et prognosticticus. It is a series of dreams and prophecies based upon the Apocalypse, in which he speaks of stellae matutinae ductu anno 1572 conspectae, and constantly brings in the rose and cross, on which account he is generally supposed to have been a Rosicrucian. Martin Luther also took for his seal the rose and cross. Some deep religious significance, at the time well understood, must have recommended the device to the choice of the Tertius Elias. Besides these obligations to the Rosicrucians, the London Freemasons also borrowed much of their phraseology from Lord Bacon's work, still fresh in men's minds, in which, adopting the idea of the House of Wisdom, a technical term with the Arab astrologers, he proposed the foundation of a Solomon's house, or learned community, dedicated to the cultivation of experimental philosophy and the advancement of science. These philosophic and royalist plotters, in order to cloak the true nature of their proceedings, conducted their conclaves according to the rules prescribed by Bacon, and the same ceremonial and nomenclature they carefully maintain to the present day. A final and demonstrative proof of the recent and English origin of Freemasonry is afforded by the dates of institution of the various foreign lodges, which are, by their own profession, branches of the parent society in London. The Parisian was not founded until the year 1725, the Madrid in 1728, and the Florentine in 1733, and yet France and Italy had been the birthplace of the actual art of Masonry, and the scene of the full glory of its revival. Another important fact remains to be noticed. The Rosicrucians still subsist amongst the Parisian Freemasons as the designation for their highest degree, to be conferred upon distinguished English visitors, although all disclaim those mystics as being the parent stock, inasmuch as that truth, if allowed, were utterly incompatible with their own claim to immemorial antiquity. Nevertheless, they loudly profess to trace their descent through the line of the Templars down from that splendidly fabulous origin they arrogate to themselves. But to return to André and the honor Nikolai assigns him as the creator of the immediate parent of modern Freemasonry, certain it is that his far-famed Rosy Cross had been ages before the regular badge of the Knights Templars. Considering how widely the order had spread its branches, obtained possession and affiliated to itself multitudes both male and female amongst the laity all over Europe, it would be a mere absurdity to believe that all its traditions were swept away at one stroke by the suppression of the Templars in the year 1307. In fact, the Parisian Templiers, as the most important division of the French Freemasons still style themselves, pretend to have kept up the succession of Grand Masters unbroken, nay more, to have preserved the archives of the order ever since that date. Francois I is even reported to have burnt alive, with a contrivance of refined cruelty in the fiery bath, 4 unfortunate gentlemen convicted of being Templars, which, if true, suffices to prove the existence of that fraternity down to a period but little removed from the public manifestation of the Rosicrucians. Communicated to me by a brother, the historical authority I cannot discover. Truly was he by such proceedings semina odii in longum jatiens, to borrow the forcible simile of Tacitus, if we are to believe Baruel's express declaration that Spartacus Weishaupt's Jacobins did no more than pay to royalty the so long deferred legacy of revenge handed down to them by generation after generation of secret societies, fulfilling the last Templar's solemn vow of vengeance against Philippe le Bel and all future kings in his person. By order of the same Francois I, his general Almeida extirpated with a cruelty unusual even in those times the remnant of the Albigenses still lurking in the villages of Provence, a sect, it should be remembered, of genuine Manicheans, transplanted thither from the East at a comparatively recent date. As Manicheans, they would naturally have preserved the symbols and tokens for mutual recognition so much in vogue, as history and existing monuments attest amongst all followers of the Gnosis. And such machinery, and grown yet more into articles of necessity, after continued persecution had transformed their congregations into regular secret societies. But dismissing all such speculations, we are under no necessity for connecting the Rosicrucians with the ancient brethren of the Temple in order to account for their display of the Gnostic symbols which figure so conspicuously in André's plates, and which have since been so diligently illustrated, though often with erroneous ingenuity, by von Hammer in his Mystery of Baphomet Revealed. Yet even his misinterpreted examples go to prove the same truth, and his Baphometic idols, whose adoration should have been the heaviest count in the charges against the Templars, though unmistakably of Cinquecento design and workmanship, are astrological and Kabbalistic sigils breathing a purely Rosicrucian spirit in their syncretism of symbolic forms. For there is one point in these sculptures alone sufficient to upset all von Hammer's elaborate structure. The Arabic legends, being cut in current Neshki characters, betray their modern manufacture. For had they been contemporary with the flourishing times of the Templars, the primitive Kufic must, as a matter of course, have been employed. Yet at the same time, these same legends indicate clearly enough the fountainhead of the doctrines held in common by all similar fraternities. But before considering this last and so important point, the subject will be more conveniently approached by our first considering the principal arguments set forth by the learned Orientalist in support of his theory. His object in truth is sufficiently declared by the title of his treatise Mysterium Baphometis Revelatum, seu fratres militiae templi qua Gnostici et quidem Ophiani, apostasiae, idololatriae et quidem impuritatis convicti per ipsa eorum monumenta, published in the Main de l'Orient, Volume 6. The treatise is copiously illustrated with fine copper plates of magical statuettes, architectural ornaments, mystical inscriptions, vases and coins. As regards historical evidence, the main foundation of his hypothesis rests upon certain heads in the articles of accusation against the Templars, dispatched by Pope Clement V to all archbishops, etc. These are the following as seen here. Such a head of silver was actually seized in the Parisian chapter house, but the Templars passed it off for a reliquary containing the skull of one of the 11,000 virgins, in spite of the long beard with which it was furnished. Rainbow page 299. Another is said to have been found elsewhere, bearing the numeral LIII. These damning evidences would naturally have been made away with by the Templars upon the first alarm of the inquiry. In this girding with a consecrated string, there is a striking analogy to the kostai prescribed by the Zoroastrian religion, still assumed by every Parsi upon his initiation, which takes place upon his completing his 7th year, and thenceforth constantly worn over the shirt. Woven out of 7 threads by the wife of the Mobed or fire priest. This distinctive badge was the most likely of all to be retained by Manes, himself a Magian, in his Christianized modification of the Persian Creed. Other articles, unnecessary to quote, allege the permission and even the obligation of unnatural practices. But from the very beginning, this last accusation, so needless to be proved, because so readily believed, has been brought against the members of all secret societies, as Ovid shows, by the popular tradition respecting Orpheus, the acknowledged founder of the Grecian mysteries. Elitium threcum populis fuit octor amorem, inteneros transferemeres citrace juventam aetatis breve veret primos carpere flores. Clarkson has more recently discussed the same question in his very ingenious essay upon the symbolical evidence of the Temple Church. Were the Templars Gnostic idolaters as alleged? He endeavors to prove their Manicheism by means of architectural evidence, deduced from the members of the edifice and the geometrical relations discoverable in the ground plan. But dispassionately considered, such arguments are of little weight, inasmuch as they could be found, if looked for, under a similar prepossession in many other buildings, both medieval and modern, having no connection whatsoever with the Brethren of the Temple. Again, a fatal objection to his theory is the fact that all such round churches are acknowledged copies of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem, which, whether Helena's original building or merely a Gothic reconstruction by the Frankish kings, the more probable explanation, was certainly not subjected to Templar influence in the laying out of its plan. The circular domical shape had been given by Helena to her church simply because that form, according to the Roman notion handed down from Etruscan antiquity, was regarded as most appropriate for a tomb. Hence, to go no further back, it was adopted for Helena's own sepulchre, Torre Pignatara, and for that of her grandchild, Constantia. In illustration of his hypothesis, Clarkson adduces the statement of Clemens Alexandrinus about the primary elements of the old Egyptians, and supposes them to have been the square, the angle, the semicircle, the circle, the oval, the line, the waved line, triangular, and the cross. These would represent the 7 primary consonants, of which the invention was attributed to Menmon, the letters with their equivalent sounds B, C, D, L, M, N, S. Should this theory have any truth in it, the frequent introduction of such figures into talismanic inscriptions obtains a satisfactory explanation. Idols of Baphomet. But it is now full time to return to von Hammer's Baphometic idols and his profound interpretations of their figures and inscriptions. It is obvious at the first glance that the idea of most of them was suggested by the Roman Jupiter Hercules, or Silenus. Classical types, by the way, entirely unknown to the art of the 12th and 13th centuries. Their heads, or rather their faces, are triple. Eyes and ears are plenteously distributed all over the body, which is moreover adorned with planetary signs. Our author sets them down without hesitation as the actual figures of the old man, adored by the knights, described so persistently by the witnesses against them as une idole avec 3 faces. The same statuettes are for the most part girded with serpents whose heads they hold in their mouths, or in various distorted attitudes, amply sufficient grounds for von Hammer to connect them with the Ophite mysteries. But this very attribute, together with the numerous eyes studding the body, would rather seem to betray an acquaintance in the sculptor with similar Hindu creations. Indra, the eye-bespangled god of the firmament, for example. Similar fancies had found their way even into the Cinquecento dress. Queen Elizabeth is painted in a gown thus embellished. Some again of these figures carry the Egyptian Tau, Marculus Masonic knocker, conspicuously suspended from the neck. But, as already hinted, the artistic composition of these well-executed monstrosities and the classical motives everywhere peeping out in their outlines seem altogether foreign to the quaint simplicity of early medieval art. The three baptismal vases or fonts on which he lays so much stress are nothing but little stone cups, 6 inches high at the utmost, covered with bas-reliefs, the phallic character whereof would seem to point to their employment in the brewing of the elixir of life from its most obvious ingredients. The second of these reliefs, explained as denoting the baptism of fire, does in truth recall to our recollection the 12 torches of the Mithraic rock tablets. For it exhibits a naked boy holding various instruments, the axe, lyre, bucket of Anubis, whilst another, blowing a horn, feeds the fire in a furnace. Of the third vase, however, the decoration savors strongly of Judaism, representing the lifting up of the brazen serpent, though the female reclining below appears rather to caress the living reptile that encircles her than to be alarmed at its embrace. Whilst the candlestick of the tabernacle, which the second female is quenching from a vase at the bidding of von Hammer's meat, personified as a regular Dutch Solomon, but with uplifted hands whence drop off chains, all betray the same source of inspiration. Bacchic and sidereal symbols, amongst which the phallus of course predominates, are plentifully strewn over the field, but the Arabic legends in the modern lettering, in this case equally with the classical air of the design in the second, suffice to convince the sober archaeologist that all three vases are nothing more than a portion of the paraphernalia of those Rosicrucian or alchemical quacks, who fattened upon the credulity of that arch-virtuoso, Rudolf II, ever since whose reign these fonts have been treasured up in the imperial cabinet. A sufficient notion of von Hammer's mode of explaining these monuments is afforded by his interpretation of the Arabic inscription upon the scroll displayed in the hands of his mété, according to him the Ophite Sophia, a female yet bearded figure whose sex is ostentatiously revealed to view. Exaltatur mete germinans stirps nostra ego et septem fuere, tuus unus renegantium, reditus proctos fit. The Baphometic idol, that head of the old man, which makes so fearful a figure in the articles of accusation, reminds one of the crowned Osiris seen in front face, otherwise that terminal figure often to be found cut on certain large green jaspers, which differ widely in style from the true Gnostic talismans dating from the Lower Empire, but rather have something about them bespeaking a medieval and Arabian origin. For example, Raspe gives a gem, number 588, with God the Father crowned with 5 stars and several barbarous characters. Reverse, a square, a sphere, a pentagon of Pythagoras, and several astrological and geometrical figures. Such a talisman was lately found in the tomb of a Knight Templar which was opened in Germany, and here it may be parenthetically observed that our Freemasons, in order to give a better color to their pretense of descent from the Templars, perpetually talk of them as the greatest builders of their times, and as the best patrons of the subordinate body of working Masons. Nothing can be more baseless than this assertion. The order invested its wealth in a far more profitable manner than in stone and mortar, and really did nothing in the way of architecture, if compared with the great monastic orders of the same period. In proof of this, notwithstanding its enormous possessions in England, no more than 4 churches were built for temples. Von Hammer, amongst the numerous examples here so indefatigably collected, presents many of a nature seemingly quite antagonistic to Catholic art, and of truly Gnostic and Oriental character. Conspicuous amongst them are the 3 vases already described, in which he discovers examples of the true Sangral, that mystic cup which shines so brightly forth in the early romances of chivalry, the quest thereof being the highest adventure proposed in the Mort d'Arthur, perfect chastity being the indispensable condition for attaining unto the sight of the miraculous vessel. And in truth, the decoration of these mystic fonts, used in the baptism of meat, the Gnostic wisdom, whence their title, Baphometic, furnishes a very plausible foundation for the charges our author brings against their supposed inventors. But as for the obscene sculptures taken from the Templar churches, which he refers to the rites of the Venus Mascula celebrated therein, these are to be found in equal abundance and shamelessness amongst the carvings of other churches totally unconnected with the order. For example, notably at Arcueil, near Paris. Such sculptures either contain a moral grossly expressed, according to the taste of their barbarous age, the censure of some particular vice, or may be no more than the ebullition of the brutal humor of the beery artist. But the gravest error into which this too sagacious interpreter has fallen is the attempt to identify the heresy of the Templar with the Ophite, that primitive form of the Gnosis, swallowed up so many ages before the foundation of the order, in the overwhelming flood of Manicheism. A flood indeed that may, even at its source, Syria, have carried away as many inquiring spirits amongst the knights, as it was simultaneously intoxicating in Italy and Provence. A great absurdity, too, is the building up his grand hypothesis upon the inexplicable mate, which he finds out for himself in these unintelligible legends, seeing that the archaic thus was never used in Gnostic times as synonymous with thesis, achamoth, an identity nevertheless taken for granted in his argument. And by the same rules does von Hammer explain the Mason's marks that he has collected, although they in no wise differ from others found in medieval buildings of every conceivable destination and origin. Before quitting this part of the subject, a word must be said upon other etymologies that have been proposed for the mighty word Baphomet. One, equally consistent with von Hammer's views, and much more so with the genius of the Byzantine language, would be thus: baptism of the mother, that special designation of Barbelo in the Valentinian theology. Such Greek technical phrases may have been perpetuated in the Manichean ritual, wherever and however late it was introduced into France. Another explanation makes Baphomet the corruption of Behemoth, meaning the golden calves Opis and Menevis, whose bones were exhibited to their worshippers, set out upon the lid of the coffin. So in later times were the bones of Manus displayed for the adoration of his followers, and those of the G.M. Hiram, according to report, at the initiation of a Templar. Hence came the death's head and coffin, that figure so conspicuously at the Carbonari conclaves, and the cognate engine of terror at our Masonic receptions when the candidate for admission, being brought to the GP, receives that sudden and awful impression on his mind that cannot fail to have the desired effect. A part of the ceremony that ought to be well attended to, as well for the honor and safety of the new-made brother as of the fraternity at large. But to return to etymology. Visconti is probably in the right, after all, in considering Baphomet no deeper mystery than the French corruption of the name Mahomet, as repeated by the ignorant witnesses for the prosecution. But although the fanciful Orientalist has pushed this theory to an unwarrantable and even ludicrous extent, yet proved facts, coupled with probabilities, will induce the unprejudiced inquirer to acquiesce in the conclusions of the judicious Raspi. The Gnosis of Basilides was an occult science which, according to his tenets, should be known only and communicated to 1 in thousands, and to 2 in 10,000s, and that if the Knights Templars were guilty of any offense at the time of their extermination, it was that of having adopted the doctrines of the Gnostics, and consequently of having renounced the established doctrine of the Church on the human nature of Christ and on the Trinity, in the place of which they, with the Gnostics, professed one supreme being, Father and Creator of all the powers which, emanating from him, have created and do govern this world. At their reception or initiation into the highest degree of the order, they received thus, that is to say, the baptism or tincture of wisdom. They were presented with a sign or symbol of their baptism, which was the pentagon of Pythagoras, and they worshipped a kind of image or idol that, like the Abraxas or this gem, was the figure of a bearded old man, or rather the representation of the only supreme being that they admitted and professed. The gem referred to is a jasper, Townley presenting Abraxas, the son or godfather or demiurgus, according to the Gnostics and necromancers. This head is crowned, the beard long, the hands crossed upon the breast. For the rest, he is formed as a term, or a mummy. In the field are 8 stars, probably an allusion to the 8 powers or heavens that are subordinate to them, according to Epiphanius. In the field are 2 Hebrew letters, as seen here. Reverse, the same God the Father, or Abraxas, in the same attitude, standing above 4 angels placed upon a sphere and receiving his emanations. In the field are 3, on the sphere are 5 stars. There are besides in the field 2 Hebrew letters, 3 lines of inscription, etc. Figures of unquestionably medieval workmanship do, however, exist, which would have stood von Hammer, had he known of them, in far better stead than the easily recognizable legacies of Rudolf II and his Rosicrucian quacks. Such is the brass statuette published by Caylus, representing a man in tight jerkin and hose, as worn under armor, but head covered with a jester's horned hood. Upon his belly is emblazoned a blazing sun. He is girt with the broad knightly belt, engraved all round with planetary signs and regular mason's marks, which also run round the edge of the tripod upon which he stands. The figure, about 5.5 inches high, extends both hands with the palms uppermost, and these are pierced with holes for the reception of the supports of some vessel, probably a magician's lamp. Amongst other devices engraved on the trunk, most conspicuous are the eagle, serpent, and crucible supporting a retort. Caylus places his drawing of it amongst his Egyptian monuments, but reasonably enough distrusting such an origin for the inscriptions suggests, with no better reason, that the work belongs to Persia. Manicheism. Manicheism has been so repeatedly referred to in the foregoing pages as to make it necessary to give a brief explanation of the way in which that strange creed may possibly have affected the religion of the Templars. And here all is either assertion of enemies or modern theory, hardly any monuments remaining that can be with certitude attributed to the Manicheans, though so numerous in their time, for they had drawn within their own circle every older form of Gnosticism in the interval between Constantine and Justinian. This deficiency is partly due to the fast increasing barbarism of those ages which produced nothing in the way of art, however degraded. Their sole religious monuments were sacred books, prayers, spells committed to perishable materials, parchment, papyrus, diligently sought out and destroyed by every persecutor. The extirpation of Gnosticism was vigorously prosecuted by the later emperors of the West and by those of the East, Arian equally with Catholic. In this pious career, the first step was made by Magnus Maximus, the British usurper under Gratian, by putting to death Priscillian, Bishop of Avila, and his chief adherents, in spite of the very unsaintly remonstrances of the good Martin of Tours. The usurper's punisher, Theodosius, also made Manicheism, Priscillian's crime, a capital offense, his edict being the first statutable infraction of the old Roman principle of universal religious toleration. In the reign of his son, Epiphanius boasts of having brought about the exile of 70 women, some noble, through whose seductions he had himself at one time been drawn into joining the Marcosians. Such a vaunt leads to the suspicion that the renegade had saved himself by turning evidence against his fellow sectarians at the opening of the persecution. Or again, this absence of Manichean relics may be accounted for by the rigid character of the creed itself, the offspring of Magism, therefore regarding all imagery as idolatrous and sinful, a tenet latterly carried out to the fullest extent by the iconoclastic Albigenses. To come now to the second diffusion of Manichaeism over Europe. In the middle of the 7th century under Constans II, Constantinus Silvanus, a native of Samosata, broached that last and most far-spreading heresy, the Paulician. The name arose from his combination of the doctrine of St. Paul with that of Zoroaster, but he had intermingled a larger proportion of the former ingredient than his precursor Manes had thought fit to do in his original theosophy. The new teacher easily united into one church the remnants of the old Gnostics, especially the Manichaeans of Armenia, and the still unconverted Zoroastrians of Pontus and Cappadocia. Incessantly persecuted by the Byzantine powers, their chief Carbeus founded a new capital for his sect, the impregnable Tephraish in the mountains near Trebizond, but which was ultimately destroyed by Basil the Macedonian about the year AD 880. But in the middle of the preceding century, the irreligious Constantine Copronymus had transplanted a large colony of these Armenian Paulicians into the depopulated Thrace, where their numbers were largely augmented in the 10th century by a fresh reinforcement drawn from the Calibian hills and planted in the valleys of Mount Haemus by John Zimisces. Here their missionaries converted the neighboring pagans, the Bulgarians, whence the sect derived a new and more odious appellation, one which in course of time from denoting heresy in religion was fixed to the branding of heresy in love. Warlike and fearless of death, we find these Paulicians serving in the Byzantine armies, notably in those of Alexius Comnenus in his wars with the Normans of Sicily. From this island as a focus, they diffused their doctrines over Italy. They gained numerous converts, even at Rome and Milan, but spread with still more astonishing rapidity through the south of France. Persons, even whose interests were diametrically opposed to the progress of the sect, joined it with inexplicable fervor. 12 canons of the Cathedral of Orleans were burnt alive at one time for embracing Paulicianism. These few facts, selected from the wide range of their history, will suffice to illustrate the diffusion of Manichaean notions during the period when the Templars were at the height of their prosperity and power. The Assassins. But Gnosticism, in one shape or other, was still surviving in the very headquarters of the order, amongst their closest allies or enemies, the mountaineers of Syria. The Templar order had been modeled after an original, the last to be looked for according to modern views, for von Hammer has here been successful in demonstrating that its constitution is a servile copy of that of the detested Assassins. The statutes of the latter prove the fact beyond all gainsaying. They were found upon the captives of their capital, Alamut, by the Mogul Halaku in the year 1335, when by a most singular coincidence, Caliph and Pope were busied in exterminating the model and the copy in the East and West at one and the same time. From these documents were verified the 8 degrees of initiation as established by Hassan, the first Grand Master or Prince of the Mountain. These degrees, probably suggested by the ancient Mithraic tests, were 1. The trial of knowledge. 2. The trial of persuasiveness, that is, the talent for proselytism. 3. Denial of the truth of the Quran and of all other sacred scriptures. 4. The trial of silent and perfect obedience. 5. The disclosure of the names of the great brothers of the order, royal, sacerdotal, and patrician, in all parts of the world. 6. The confirmation of all the preceding steps of knowledge. 7. The allegorical interpretation of the Quran and of all other scriptures. In this lodge, the divinity of all founders of religious systems was alike denied. Religion was shown to be a mere step to knowledge, its narratives to be merely allegorical and exhibiting the progress of civil society. Thus, man's fall signified political slavery, redemption, his restoration to liberty and equality. 8. That all actions were indifferent provided only they were done for the good of the order, there being no such thing absolutely as vice or virtue. The maxim of the Jesuits, that implicit obedience includes the commission of a mortal sin. It will be seen that the principle running through these degrees is identical with that pervading the main counts in the articles of accusation brought against the Templars. The same author, History of the Assassins, shows that the organization of the Templars was exactly modeled upon that of the Assassins, and thus confronts the several degrees in each of the two orders. Of the Assassins. 1. The Grand Master or Prince of the Mountain. 2. The Dais al-Kabir or 3 great viceroys under him. 3. The Dais or provincial masters. And 4. The Refek or chaplains. 5. The Lazik or military body. 6. The Fedavi or death devoted. 7. The Batani or secret brethren, that is, those affiliated to the order of the Templars. 1. The Grand Master. 2. The 3 Grand Priors. 3. The Provincial Prior. 4. The Chaplains. 5. The Knights. 6. The Esquires. 7. The Serving Brethren. 8. The Donati and Oblati. 9. The Affiliati. The benefits of affiliation were obtained at the small annual fee of 2 or 3 deniers. One of the chief causes of Philippe le Bel's hatred against the order was their refusal, in the early part of his reign, to admit him into this class. The Donati and Oblati were sworn in return for the protection afforded to them by the order to leave to it all their property at their deaths, and consequently to refrain from having offspring or even to stand sponsors to the children of others. If married at the time of joining the order, they were bound to put away their wives. Infraction of the vow was punished by perpetual imprisonment. The affiliati had probably nothing to do with the secrets of the order. They merely, in return for a certain sum paid down, received their daily maintenance, their commons, out of the corporate fund. such an arrangement being a simple anticipation of the principle of life annuities, and admirably suited to the requirements of those barbarous times. It is not a matter for surprise that the grand elements of ancient Gnosticism should have thus been discovered lurking in the secret rules of the Order of Assassins. When the origin of that order is investigated, it proves to be only a branch of the Ismailites, or those Persians who supported the cause of the descendants of Ali. But Abdallah himself, imagine, had from the beginning founded in the midst of these Ismailites a secret society composed of those Persians who had, through Arab compulsion, embraced Mohammedanism only in name. By inculcating those vital dogmas of the old Gnosis, that knowledge was the real end of religion, and that in all scriptures the allegorical interpretation was the only true one, Abdallah united under his teaching the remnants of all the older religions that still lurked in Persia. In fact, he did in Persia under the Caliph what the new Manichean Chrysocher was doing at Tiflis under the Byzantine emperor. The Ismailites, having gradually become absorbed into the new sect, succeeded in the 10th century in placing a prince of Ali's line upon the throne of Cairo, thus founding the Fatimite dynasty. After this, Hassan, who had served with distinction under the Seljuk sultans, aided by his brethren to when he had returned, having captured the hill fortress of Alamut, or the Vulture's Nest, 1090 AD, set himself up there as an independent prince and established his community as a political body under the constitution already described. In a short time, these bold sectaries made themselves masters of all the strong places of Lebanon, thereby securing their independence of the Egyptian caliph. The Druses are only the modern representatives of the suppressed assassins. Like them, they are Ismailites, their ostensible founder being Hakim, a Fatimite caliph of Cairo, who professed himself the new incarnation of the Godhead. Their notion that the present seat of their ever-absent Grand Master is Europe tallies curiously enough with von Hammer's theory about the close relationship that existed between the Templars and the actual progenitors of the Druses. These same Druses may also possibly represent the polytheists and Samaritans who flourished so vigorously in the Lebanon as late as the times of Justinian, to whose persecuting zeal Procopius ascribes the extermination of 1 million inhabitants of that district alone. Of their present creed, preserved in unviolated secrecy, nothing authentic has ever come to light. Popular belief amongst their neighbors makes them adorers of an idol in the form of a calf, and to celebrate their nocturnal assemblies, orgies like those laid to the charge of the Ophites in Roman, of the Templars in Mediæval, and of the Freemasons, Continental, in modern times. Their notion of their head residing in Scotland has an odd resemblance to the German appellation Scottish Brethren given to our Masons. Some such association of ideas seems to have led the Lessing to maintain that Freemason, in German Mason, has nothing whatever to do with the English meaning of the word, but comes from Mass only, the proper name for a Templar lodge, called also a round table. For this derivation he cites Agricola, an authority removed by no more than 150 years from the date of the suppression of the order. On this account, he adds, the old Templar buildings in Bologna and Milan still retain the title de la Magione, that is, of the Mason. Although a less acute critic would most assuredly only be able to discover here nothing deeper than an Italian corruption of the French Maison in its common sense. The Sufis. The influence of the Crusades and their results upon the mind and life of medieval Europe cannot possibly be exaggerated. The true masters of the Western barbarians in philosophy, science, and many of the arts were the Arabs, firstly those of Syria, later of Spain. Together with their learning, they communicated other ideas far different from those originally contemplated by their pupils. Nevertheless, the connection between their science and their secret creed was so intimate that in reality no other result was to be looked for. So much of primitive Gnosticism before its admixture with Christianity was based upon magism, that is, upon astrological ideas, as to make it often difficult to determine whether a Gnostic monument involves a religious notion or is merely a sidereal talisman. For example, the Decani of the Signs, whose figures, according to Tusser, were commonly worn as amulets, are often to be seen bearing the names inscribed of Michael and other Jewish angels. In the flourishing times of Mohammedanism, before the spread of universal ignorance had established everywhere the dull reign of uninquiring orthodoxy, there existed at its very heart, probably originating in Persia, an esoteric body, styling themselves Sufi, a title evidently derived from the Greek sophoi, their predecessors. Now, this title appears assumed as equivalent to the previous Gnostikoi, although with far more arrogance, since these wise men claimed the possession of that knowledge of things divine, which the Gnostics, by their own designation, were only desirous of knowing. Meantime, the tenets they held were precisely those of the old anti-tacti, ordinance haters, as to the indifference of all things pertaining to the body and the invalidity of the Jewish moral law, the mere appointment of the demiurgus, as regarded the regulation of the life of the spiritual man. Just as it is a constant charge of the fathers against the primitive Gnostics that they outwardly conformed without scruple, in order to escape all annoyance, to the established religion of whatever place they chanced to inhabit, it is equally probable that the Manicheans and other sectaries of Asia, persecuted with like zeal by Orthodox Byzantine and Zoroastrian Persian, would gladly shelter themselves under the easy cloak of the true religion of their Arab conquerors during the 2 centuries following Justinian's reign, and either save their liberty by professing Mohammedanism, or else continue as tributaries in the unmolested exercise of their old faith, being confounded by the uninquisitive conqueror under the general name of infidels. The semi-Magian Abdallah and his New Ismailites have a strong family resemblance to Weishaupt and his Illuminati in the last century. The sects of Egypt and Syria, says Gibbon, enjoyed a free toleration under the shadow of the Arabian caliphs, and therefore may reasonably be supposed to have maintained their peculiar notions and observances down to the time of the Crusades. Of such protracted existence we have the most convincing proof at the present day, in the numerous sect, the Mandates or Nazarenes of the Shatil Arab and Bassora, veritable Gnostics holding a creed, the true image of that of Mans in their Book of Adam, and detested by their Christian and Muslim neighbors alike. Now, inasmuch as these Sufi were composed exclusively of the learned amongst the Persians and Syrians, at a time when learning signified little else than proficiency in medicine and astrology, the 2 points that brought the Eastern sages into amicable contact with their barbarous invaders from the West, it is easy to see how the latter may have imbibed the esoteric doctrines simultaneously with the other teaching of those who were their sole instructors in all matters pertaining to science and art. Now, the Sufi doctrine was based on that grand idea, one universal creed that could be secretly held under the outward profession of any established religion, taking in fact virtually the same view of all religious systems as that in which the philosophers of old had regarded them. Such too had been a striking feature in the Gnostic teaching. The Naseni, or Ophites, says Hippolytus, boasted in language truly Masonic, "We of all men are the only Christians, standing in the third gate and anointed with the ineffable unction out of the horn like David, not out of the earthen vessel like Saul, who consorted with the evil spirit of carnal concupiscence." These same genuine Christians at the same time zealously celebrated all the mysteries of paganism, affirming that in their higher knowledge they possessed the only key to the one truth locked up under those superstitious ceremonies. And in our day, the acknowledgement of one universal religion by the Freemasons, as expressed by their requiring from the candidate for admission nothing more than the declaration of his belief in one God, is denounced with pious horror by the bigots of every variety of the Christian scheme. This recognition of one universal religion in fact pervades all the works of the lights of Mohammedan literature. In the Maqamat of Hariri, the sermons preached by his hero, the dervish, are full of a sentiment more sublime when touching upon things pertaining unto God, a sentiment harmonizing infinitely more closely with those of enlightened religious men of our times upon the same subject. In a word, these sermons breathe a spirit, in every respect more Christian, to use the modern phrase, than characterizes any writings of the actual Christian divines, the contemporaries of the author. He flourished in the 9th century, but this is necessarily so, Hariri and Mohammedans like him, being guided by the traditions of the old philosophy, still secretly maintained amongst them, whilst the spirit of modern Christianity is strongly, though unconsciously, directed by precisely the same influence revived, though under a different name, and professedly contemning its real source. Again, the greatest of all Mohammedan sovereigns, the Mughal Akbar, was a true Sufi. Equally so was his prime minister and historian Abul Farez. It would be difficult to find in a modern Christian prayer book, much less in any one composed in his age, an address to the deity so sublime, so consonant with our present notions, as the invocation opening his Ayn Akbari. In all such outpourings of Oriental adoration, no allusion whatever to their special lawgiver is to be detected, nothing to betray any distinctive sectarian prejudice. The reader, if unacquainted with the history of the author, would admire but know not to what creed to adjudge the composition. Akbar, according to his vizier, made a point of never ridiculing or condemning any form of religion. He had thus, perhaps without knowing it, reverted to the grand and distinguishing feature of the religion of Greece and Rome in their best times that discerned the same great truth, the real basis of universal toleration, that all religious systems were but expressions of the same idea, by saint, by savage, or by sage. Wherever in ancient times the principle of toleration was apparently violated, it was in cases where the rites, by their corruption, had become prejudicial to public welfare, as when the Senate put down the Bacchanalia, or Claudius the Druids in Gaul, on account of their human sacrifices, exactly as Hero of Syracuse had made it an article in his treaty with the vanquished Carthaginians that they should discontinue their burnt offerings of young children to Melkarth. Hesiod's maxim, me arretoire momuane, was that of his race as well as of the Roman, and the same was the guiding principle of Akbar. From a hint dropped by his panegyrist, it would almost appear that the emperor had imbibed some slight tinge of Zoroastrian doctrine, for he remarks his particular veneration for the element of fire, and again the significant circumstance of his regulating his frequent daily prayers by the position of the sun in the heavens. And what bears directly upon our subject, his favorite occupation was to converse with the Sufi and the learned of all nations and religions. It sounds also very odd to hear a Mohammedan grandee, like this writer, declaring that amongst the Brahmins were to be found the most virtuous men upon earth. Those very religionists in whom Akbar's successors, like Aurangzeb, could, quite according to our own ideas of what necessarily should have been his feeling, discern nothing but devil worshippers, whom it was his bounden duty either to convert or exterminate. Diffusion of Oriental culture, the constant intercourse between Syria and Europe, maintained first by the flocks of pilgrims perpetually crowding to Jerusalem, then by the Crusades, and lastly by the establishment of the Frankish kingdom in Palestine and of the different principalities upon the coast, produced vast effects, both apparent and concealed, upon the nations of Europe, more especially those seated upon the Mediterranean. Arabian influence brightly manifests itself in the poetry of the troubadours, half amatory, half mystical like its model, of a spirit differing as widely from the materialism of classic elegiacs, as does the pointed Saracenic architecture, with all its forms suggested by the tent pole and curtain, from the massive Romanesque which it so rapidly displaced. Of poetry and architecture alike, the germs had been carried into France by the causes already noticed, and kept in full vigor by the permanent establishment of the two great military orders, having their headquarters in Jerusalem, but looking principally to France for recruits and resources. For the Crusades were eminently a French idea, and both leaders and soldiers in the most important of them were either actual Frenchmen or princes holding territories in France. Our Norman kings, for example. How many arts, the most admired in those ages, are direct importations from Syria or Egypt? Glassworking in all its processes connected with the manufacture of ornamental and colored vessels, and painted windows, enameling, majolica, damascening on steel, the coinage of gold, the cultivation of the silkworm. The Italian language has preserved this history in the terms purely Arabic, still designating things pertaining to all such processes as zecca, tazza, cameo, mantece, rocca, gala, pataka, ricamare, etc. Italian Gothic, particularly its civil branch, as exemplified in the buildings of the great maritime cities on the Mediterranean, those on the Adriatic continued faithful to the Byzantine taste, such as Genoa, Pisa, Florence, is a mere transcript of Cairo and Rosetta, to the latest days of the style bearing no resemblance to the Gothic then flourishing beyond the Alps. This diffusion of Oriental ideas over Europe has a very important bearing upon the present inquiry, for it explains the readiness with which Manicheism was embraced in France during the 2 centuries preceding the fall of the Templars. These very Templars are found during their residence in Palestine exhibiting a tolerant spirit, utterly inconsistent with the ostensible object of their institution, making alliances with any of the neighboring emirs able to assist them in holding their own against the common enemy, the Soldan of Egypt, amongst whom figures conspicuously that arch-Gnostic, the redoubtable old man of the mountain. His practice of intoxicating the neophyte with hashish, extract of hemp, before admission into his terrestrial paradise, gave the sect the name, afterwards accepted by the Italians in its present opprobrious sense, profession of continence. A distinguishing feature of Gnosticism was the profession of continence, at least as far as regards the propagation of the human species, which was denounced to the spiritual as the doing in the highest measure the will of the demiurgus, and the perpetuating the reign of matter. The strange means they adopted to preserve their vow inviolate may be learnt by referring to Clemens, where he quotes their interpretation of the ancient fable about Saturn's devouring his own children, or to Epiphanius when he describes the rites of the Ophite Eucharist. In no other doctrine of the Gnosis is the Buddhistic influence more clearly traceable than in this, for any intrinsic merit in similar asceticism, as practiced purely for its own sake, was never dreamed of by the Grecian philosophy, that offspring of reason in her brightest and most uncorrupted development. This self-same affectation of purity contributed, even more than the proclaimed liberty of conscience, to promote the spread of Gnostic tenets in every age of their development, from Valentinus down to the Grand Apostle of Languedoc, Nicetas of Constantinople. His Manichean bishops owed their success in great measure to their black robes and professed abstinence from, nay more, pious horror of all the pleasures of sense. For any preaching is certain to obtain flocks of converts that shall make, besides the promise of fully explaining things too high for man's understanding, an outward and noisy profession of asceticism, and proclaim the exaltation of the poor and the certain damnation of the rich as a capital article of its creed. For the vulgar mind ever admires what is difficult merely because it is difficult, however useless in itself may be the result, or even pernicious to society in its consequence, if logically carried out. And inasmuch as the abstinence from sensual pleasures is to them the hardest of all tests, so much the more is the ostentation of similar self-denial the most effectual method for gaining ascendancy over brutish intelligences, utterly incapable of distinguishing the means from the end. Moreover, such doctrines find powerful allies ready existing for them in the natural enviousness and greed of common souls. The actually poor being ever the vast majority in the land, such hearers joyfully receive the teaching that promises the punishment of their betters in the next world, purely as a counterbalance to their superior happiness in this, whilst as scarcely anyone considers himself as a truly rich man, but is constantly climbing upwards towards a point that constantly recedes before him at every successive stage of his ascent. Even the wealthy convert is enabled to hold the comfortable assurance that he himself continues in the category of the poor, and that the anathema is only launched against the one immediately above himself on the social ladder. In this feeling lies the true secret of the amazing success of Manichaeism, its rapid absorption into itself of the earlier Gnostic forms, and above all of the facility with which it got possession of those very regions where the Catholic Church was the most richly endowed, and where her clergy, particularly the regular, were attracting the greatest envy by their wealth and ostentation. The Templars began their course in actual poverty, leading a doubly hard, laborious life. that of monk and soldier combined. To express this poverty, the original device or common seal of the order bore two knights mounted upon the same horse, the most striking exemplification of humility that could be imagined in those days of chivalry. Becoming ashamed of such a badge as they grew in power, they altered it into the somewhat similar outline of a Pegasus, such at least is the old tradition. The winged horse, however, may from the first have involved a more spiritual meaning, elusive to the heavenward aspirations of those initiated into the order. And when their career was drawing to a close amidst the wealth and luxury that drew down upon them so cruel a destruction, the brethren, no doubt through some ingenious node of self-deception, still flattered themselves that their vows were as faithfully observed as in the very springtide of their institution. Mithraicism. The strange and obscene ceremonies observed on the admission of neophytes into the various secret societies that flourished under the Lower Empire and in the Middle Ages are all of them no more than faint traditions of the penances or 12 tortures that purchased admission into the cave of Mithras. How widely diffused were these Mithraici, especially in the West, is attested by the innumerable tablets, altars and inscriptions still remaining in Germany, France and this country. The religion of Mithras was so readily embraced and flourished so extensively amongst all the Celtic races in consequence of its analogy to the previously dominant Druidical religion. This affinity had struck with astonishment that sagacious observer, the elder Pliny, who must have had ample opportunity for forming a correct judgment during his protracted military service upon the Rhine. He declares, Gallias iutique possedit, magica et quidem ad nostram memoriam, namque Tiberi Caesaris principatus sustulit druidas eorum et hoc genus vatum medicorumque per senatus consultum. Quid ego haec commemorem in arte oceanum quoque transgressa et ad naturae inane pervecta, Britannia hodieque celebrat, tantis ceremonies ut dedisse per sis videri possit, ad eoista toto mundo consensere quamquam discordi et sibi ignoto, ne satis est mari potest quantum Romanis debeatur, qui sustulere monstra in quibus hominem occidere religiosissimum erat, mandi vero etiam saluberimum. 100 years before, Caesar had stated, Disciplina druidica in Britannia reperta atque inde in Galliam translata esse estimatur, et nunc qui diligentius eam rem cognoscere volunt plerumque eo descendi causa proficis cuntur. The subjects of study in the Druidical school were literally those of the Magian Gnosis, multa praeterea desideribus eorumque motu, de mundi ac terrarum magnitudine, de rerum natura, de deorum immortalium viac potestate disputant. For Pliny, by his Magica, understands the rites instituted by Zoroaster and first promulgated by Osthenes to the outer world, this Osthenes having been military chaplain to Xerxes during his expedition into Greece. And this judgment of the Romans is fully borne out by native evidence. For Druidism, such as it appeared in its final struggle with Christianity during the short-lived independence of Britain after the withdrawal of the legions, is a religion agreeing most wonderfully in many important points with the doctrine of Zoroaster. Thus, it expressly teaches the eternal existence and antagonism of the two principles, the final triumph of good and the renovation of all things. A most valuable fragment of early Druidical teaching Plutarch has preserved to us in his strange essay On the Face in the Moon by the title of The Doctrine of the Sons of Saturn, which is full of Gnostic ideas, those of Mans, for instance, and even of Gnostic expressions. Now, Manes himself started as a Zoroastrian priest and framed his new creed, according to Epiphanius, by engrafting upon the original the transcendental Buddhistic notions picked up by his true master, Scythicus, during his travels in India. Is there not then a possibility that some sparks of the ancient Mithraic doctrine may have lingered unnoticed in the West until made to blaze up anew by the congenial breath of the Paulician apostles? Similarly, there is every reason to believe that the medieval witches' Sabbat preserved uninterrupted the ceremonial of the ancient rural orgia, the only change being in the name of the presiding deity. Michelet is of this opinion in describing the immense Sabbats of the 17th century. Indeed, one may even now discern the awful antique ceremonial as parodied to the minutest particular in the procedure of the modern convivial heteria. For Jerome's Miles, the lowest grade in the cave of Mithras, the Templars' watchmen placed on the roof of the house or church wherein the chapter is held, have their exact representative in the armed man, the Tyler, lowest official, who stands sentinel at the door of the Freemasons' secret conclave. The Druidical temple, always circular in ground plan, whether formed out of native rocks or built with Gallo-Roman masonry, as in its latest example at Lontef in Bretagne, consisting of 2 concentric enclosures pierced with numerous arches, bears in this point a remarkable analogy to all other structures dedicated to the element of fire. Such is the plan of the Temple of Moloch, uncovered at Carthage by Davis. The Roman Vesta's temple, the Guebra fire temples at Balkh, to this day circular towers, and the great Sasanian temple at Gazakas, destroyed by Heraclius in his invasion. The spherical edifice within the palace containing the abominable idol of Chosroes, the image of himself, enthroned as in heaven, and all round him the sun, moon, and stars, which the superstitious king worshipped as gods. Angels also had he placed standing about him like scepter-bearers. Moreover, this enemy of God had so contrived by means of certain mechanism that drops of water should fall from the ceiling to imitate rain, and that sounds of thunder should reverberate therefrom. Our Verulamium also boasted a Mithraic temple commensurate to the importance of the place, until destroyed by the superstitious barbarian Ealdred, 8th abbot of St. Albans, for to no other purpose could have served the very deep grotto, covered with an unbroken hill of earth, and approached by a subterraneous passage, the ruins of which were yet visible when Matthew Paris wrote, Specus quoque profundissimum monte continuo circumseptum, cum spelunca subterranea quam quondam, Draco ingens fecerat et inhabitavit, in loco qui vulmenhet disitur in quantum potuit explanavit, vestigia tamen aeterna habitationis serpentinae derelinquens. The transmission of Gnostic symbols. The foregoing considerations seem to furnish a reasonable solution of the problem set to the archaeologist in the continued existence of genuine Gnostic symbols, whether in their pristine significancy or as mere dead forms, is for the Masons themselves to judge, still paraded before us as things holy and full of meaning. Treasured up amongst the Sufis of Persia and the dark sectaries of the Lebanon, thence transmitted to the Templars and handed over by them to their legitimate heirs, the Brethren of the Rosy Cross, these signs maintain a perpetual vitality. The famous pentacle, Solomon's seal of the Templars, was, thinks Nicolai with good reason, the powerful symbol prescribed in the diagramma of the Ophites to be offered by the ascending soul to the genius of each sphere, to extort from them free passage to the supernal light. O first and seventh one, Ildebaoth, Aeon of Saturn, born to rule with power, chief word of the pure intelligence, perfect work in the sight of the Father and the Son. By presenting unto thee in this seal the sign of life, I open the gate which thy power hath closed to the world, and freely traverse thy domains. A sufficient reason this for the constant appearance of this particular sigil upon tombstones of every date. The reverence with which the Hindus still regard the same figure has been already noticed. In its 5 points lies concealed the same expression of the virtues of that numeral as was conveyed to the Grecian philosopher by the Delphic E, interpreted in the same sense as by Plutarch. In the Middle Ages, the pentacle was held a sure protection against all danger of fire, though found unavailing, alas, for its nightly wearers. Berenger's dictum being too well verified, les hérétiques n'ont pas trouvé engouement pour la brûlure, and was therefore regularly painted up in buildings that from their destination were particularly liable to such risk, brewhouses amongst the rest. This last custom explains how the pentacle came at last to indicate the places where fermented liquors were on sale. The Illuminati. As for the transmission of these symbols, the question would be at once settled should we accept the bold declaration of Lessing, for which, however, we have only his own authority. The lodges of the Templars were in the very highest repute during the 12th and 13th centuries, and out of such a Templars' lodge, which had been continually kept up in the heart of London, was the Society of Freemasons established in the 17th century by Sir Christopher Wren. But this venerable tradition is directly contravened by the testimony of the most unimpeachable of all witnesses, the Grand Illuminato, Spartacus Weishaupt himself. At Munich, in the St. Theodosius Lodge in 1777, he received the first Masonic degrees, but was inexpressibly disappointed on finding in Masonry nothing beyond les jeux d'une fraternité innocente. Nevertheless, he suspected that something deeper yet remained, and soon his expectations were fulfilled. That same winter, his friend, Cato Zwack, had an interview at Augsburg with a certain Abbé Marotti, who conferred upon him the highest degrees, even those of the Scottish lodges, and expounded to him all the mysteries founded, according to the abbé, upon the religion and history of the Church. Zwack lost no time in communicating his acquisitions to Weishaupt, who replies, "The important discovery you have made at Nicomedia in your interviews with Marotti gives me extreme pleasure. Let us profit by the circumstance and extract from it all the advantages possible." Weishaupt had therefore been anticipated by his explanation of their symbolism, which he himself adopted in the new mysteries he founded. Barruel adds that the charge of Illuminatism does not apply to the first 3 degrees of Masonry, neither to such as hold that these 3 degrees alone belong to the real, ancient fraternity. This would intimate that the Rosicrucian had been later grafted upon the original number of gradations in the Masonic hierarchy. For the sake of comparison, I shall give Barruel's account of the degrees amongst the Illuminati, the predecessors of the Jacobins, viz. 1. Novices. 2. Brethren of Minerva. 3. Minor Illuminate. 4. Major Illuminate or Scottish novices. 5. Scottish Knights. 6. The Lesser Mysteries, Epopte or Illuminati priests. 7. The Regent or Illuminato Prince. 8. The Greater Mysteries, the Magus or Kingman. Like the Rosicrucians, each novice upon admission received his characteristic or mystic name taken from Roman history. He then studied the geography of the order, which classicized modern places after a similar fashion. Then he acquired the cipher, of which the simple set was this, as seen here. The other, more abstruse cipher consisted of particular symbols. The novitiate lasted from 2-3 years, according to the age of the candidate. One of the things most strictly prohibited was to ever write the name of either order or lodge. They must be expressed by thus and thus, respectively. Brother A.B., write upon this manuscript of the R.S. of this degree. In his attempt to do this, he receives a severe and prudent C by the J.D. placed behind him for that purpose, by the C.T. united to his F, etc. Masonic ceremonial. In the admission to his degrees, Weishaupt adopted all the Masonic ceremonial. For example, in making the Scottish Knight, the secret conclave was hung with green. The prefect, booted and spurred, wearing St. Andrew's cross by a green ribbon tied on saltire, sat under a green canopy and received the candidate similarly equipped, holding a mallet for scepter. There was also the triple benediction and the sacrament to conclude, administered by the chaplain. At the making of the Apoptos, he was taken blindfolded by his sponsor in a perfectly closed coach by a circuitous route into the hall now hung with red. On a table covered with scarlet were laid the crown and scepter, heaps of gold mingled with chains. On a cushion lay a white robe and girdle. The novice was told to choose. If he took the gold, he received a severe reprimand, phrased with a lot of humanitarian cant too tedious to copy here, and unnecessary besides, seeing that the same is perpetually dinned into our ears at the present day. The popular notion of the brand mark received by Masons on initiation is derived from the stigmata impressed upon the ancient Mystae at their admission. A remarkable example is that of Ptolemy Auletes, who was thus marked in several parts of the body with the lotus, the colocynth flower, and the timbrel of Cybele, Plutarch de Dignoscendo Adulatore. The remarking of the Mithraici has been noticed in the section devoted to that worship, pages 139 and 140. Hence came the medieval belief in the secret mark impressed by the devil at the Sabbat upon those who swore allegiance to him, and which mark could be recognized by the witch-finders from its insensibility to pain. At the end, the Hierophant delivered a long address upon natural liberty and equality, and all the rest thereto pertaining. Weishaupt, a professional atheist, was both astonished and diverted at finding eminent Protestant divines, after their initiation, declaring that all these notions were the genuine doctrines of the gospel, which was certainly a very awkward truth to be held by the friends of the established order of civilized society. It is not, however, less a truth if the same doctrines be carried out to their logical consequences, instead of being employed in defending ideas deduced in reality from a totally different source. But Baruel, the refugee, who had just seen the doctrines of liberty, equality, and fraternity practically and naturally expounded by means of the guillotine reasonably enough, puts down this declaration of Weishaupt's as the most conclusive proof of his audacious impiety. Conclusion. The symbols, forming the proper subject of the present inquiry, embodied in their origin the deepest mysteries of Brahminical theosophy. They were eagerly accepted by the subtle genius of the Alexandrine school and applied to the hidden wisdom of Egypt. And lastly, in their captivating and illusory promise of enlightenment, the few bright spirits of the Middle Ages sought for something better than the childish fables engendered by monkery upon the primal Buddhistic stock, which then constituted the faith. And these holy figurations still continue to flourish, but only as the insignia and mummery of what at best a mere charitable is perhaps only a convivial association. In the same way, Apollo's golden pentagon, which of yore blazed on high above the Delphic shrine, in the Middle Ages the badge of the proudest order of chivalry, and a sure defense from peril of lightning and fire, has come at last to be degraded into the mere sign of a German pothouse. A master mason of the very highest degree lately informed me that he had detected the signs now in use, engraved amongst the sculptures in the cave temples of Elephanta. And what is still more important, that although the Brahmins are Masons, yet if a European makes the sign to them, they immediately put their hands up before their eyes, as if to shut out the sight of the profanation of things holy. But this curious fact can be explained with the utmost certainty. The Dionysiac mysteries, the most popular of all in Greece, were believed to have been introduced direct from Syria, and necessarily brought along with them all the signs and rites of their birthplace. The painted vases of the period of the decadence, of the 4th and 3rd centuries before our era, take for their favorite subject scenes from the celebration of these mysteries, and in these pictures mystic sigli perpetually recur, amongst which the Philfot shines conspicuous. But in truth, all the ancient mysteries came from the East, as their names, the Phrygian, the Mithraic, the Iliac, declare, and these mysteries existed publicly almost to the close of the Roman Empire, and how much further down into medieval times they existed as secret and prohibited things, it is impossible to decide. From the very nature of things, we may be certain that their signs and symbols, after the esoteric doctrines were forgotten, passed into the repertory of all who used curious arts, the alchemists, astrologers, and wizards of the Dark Ages, and then became the property of Rosicrucians, who truly were the parent stock, and not a recent brand, as is now pretended, of the present Freemasons. The Jews have a tradition that the boards of the tabernacle were marked with Hebrew letters as a guide for their adjustment in the setting up of that migratory temple. Writing, therefore, becomes one of the 32 works interdicted to every religious Jew upon the Sabbath day. It is a singular coincidence that the stones of the wall of Servius Tullius at Rome are inscribed with masons' marks that much resemble Phoenician letters. A most important contribution to the history of Masons' marks has, 1877, been obtained through the researches of Arno Aldivelli amongst the Gallic cemeteries around Bologna. Many of the vases there exhumed bear sigli upon their bases, more rarely upon their sides, which are unmistakably of the same nature, and what is more curious, are constructed on the same principle as those used by the regular stonemason at this very day. Those in Class A, see Veli's Scavi Presso Bologna, may be considered as of the highest authority because they are the actual stamps of the potter, impressed upon the clay before baking. That they distinguished individuals and were not merely religious symbols, but stood for the proper names of people unacquainted with writing, may be inferred not only from the established custom of antiquity in this respect, but from the much more frequent occurrence of the class, of which he gives examples in List B. These are scratched upon the bases after baking, and therefore must have been added by the buyers, not by the makers. The great variety in the forms of these latter sigilli sufficiently proves that they were the marks of private persons, not of clans or tribes. Class C of similar marks engraved upon articles of metal lead irresistibly to the same conclusion. It must, however, be observed that although these characters cannot be distinguished at first sight from the modern mason's marks, of which I have given specimens in the large plate, it appears upon examination that no care has been taken to make them end in an odd number of points, the guiding rule with the modern craft. To come from the Cisalpine to the Western Gauls, some evidence of the same practice is deducible from their coins. The large Bilon pieces, evident copies of Alexander's tetradrachms, found so plentifully in the Channel Islands, often bear a figure upon the cheek of the Hercules' head and repeated in the field of the reverse. What can these symbols placed so prominently to catch the eye have been intended for, but to inform the world what particular tribe of the Confederation using one national type had issued the coin thus distinguished? There is some analogy to this in the Greek series, where distant cities use the type of Athens or Corinth, but make it their own by placing some appropriate symbol in the field. We need not, however, carry out this theory to the same fanciful length as does the Baron Donop, who, struck by the evident resemblance of these figures to the Hindu caste marks, builds upon it a complete history of the migration of the Aryans into Jersey and points out the Puranic deities to whom each of such symbols is to be referred. Of these figures, again, a great variety and much better executed are to be seen in the field of the pretty hemidrachms of Solimara, which, as well as those above mentioned, belong to the times immediately preceding Caesar's conquest of Gaul, a date clearly ascertained from that of the Roman denarii, often forming part of the same deposits. Of the continued use of these marks under the Roman rule in Gaul, some vestiges are still to be discovered. The pile cinq Mars, which cuts so ludicrous a figure in Rabelais' description of Gargantua's horse, is a lofty quadrangular column ending in a point in the most compact and skillfully executed brickwork, apparently built within the 1st century of the empire. Upon each face, towards the top, are wrought in bricks of different color from the main structure various devices of the same sort as those of the coins. These can be nothing else than the armorial bearings of the several cities or tribes that had combined together for the erection of so costly a monument, which we may safely suppose intended for one of those plurima simulacra of Mercury which Caesar noticed in Gaul, and which forms the intermediate link between the upright stones, menhirs, roughly cut into a phallic shape at top of the uncivilized Aborigines, and the grand colossus of Zenodorus, to which native taste had advanced by the time of Nero. A lucky accident has thrown in my way another and much more curious proof of the use of these marks by the more barbarous part of the Celts at a much later period. That the decoration of the skin which gave the name to the Picts consisted in stigmata in the literal sense of the word and not in mere dyeing with woad like the early Britons is made out by Claudian's definite expression. Feroce notatas pelegit ex animis picto moriente figuras, de Bello Getico 26, 417 and 418. The Book of Kells is a MS, written sometime in the 9th century. In one of the facsimiles of its pages published by the Paleographical Society, amongst the ornamentation of one vast initial letter, the most conspicuous is the figure of a naked man, writhing himself amongst its most intricate convolutions. This man's body is entirely covered with marks of various forms, and from the circumstances under which the drawing was made, we can safely assume that we have here preserved to us the portrait of a true Pict, taken from the life. The 4 centuries that had elapsed since Claudian wrote were not likely to have changed the customs of a country so remote, and in which the small amount of civilization derivable from its Romanized neighbors must have gone backwards in proportion as they relapsed into their pristine barbarism. This pictured Pict may also lead us to conclude that the sigil seen upon the cheek of the Jersey Hercules was actually tattooed upon that of the Gaul who issued the coin. Out of deference to the popular belief in the Masonic brand mark, I shall wind up this section with a few observations upon that most time-honored method of distinguishing those initiated into any mystic community. to give precedence to the patron saint of Freemasons, St. John the Divine, his making the followers of the beast receive his mark upon the forehead and the palm of the hand is a clear allusion to the Mithraical practice, of which Augustine, as already quoted, speaks in mentioning a certain demon that will have his own image purchased with blood. Ptolemy Philopator, whom Plutarch describes as passing his sober hours in the celebration of mysteries and in beating a tambourine about the palace, submitted also to receive the Dionysiac brand marks, which were no doubt those symbols so plentifully introduced into the vase paintings of Bacchanalian rites. Brand marks, however, is an incorrect name for such insignia, for they were imprinted on the skin not by fire, but by the milder process of tattooing, as we learn incidentally from Vegetius, and also that it was the regular practice in the Roman army in his day, the close of the 4th century. He advises that the recruit be not tattooed with the devices of the standards, punctis signorum inscribendus est, until he has been proved by exercises as to whether he be strong enough for the service. That these tattoo marks were the distinctive badges painted on the shields of the different legions may be inferred from their insertion in the epitaphs of individuals of each corps. The golden Delphic epsilon surmounted by a fillet of roses. For the explanation of the symbol, see page 297, Cameo in Agate Onyx, New York, page 431. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.